Welcome, good people. My name is James Kamau, and I'm excited for this session that we're going to have today. Today we'll tackle one of the toughest challenges that the marine sector faces in this day and age, and that is the degradation of the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is one of the world's greatest wonders. Found in the northeastern coast of Australia, this beauty covers over 2,300 kilometers. In that stretch, it occupies an area of more than 135,000 square meters. This makes it one of the biggest, if not the biggest, structure built by the marine life. The reef itself is home to more than 2,000 species of fish, and it has more than 400 types of coral reefs. According to an article by Encounter Edu Limited, produced in the year 2002, it is definitive that globally, coral reefs occupy less than 1% of the ocean. But this 1% actually supports more than 25% of the marine ecosystem. This just shows that they are invaluable ecosystems that support ocean sustainability, the social, economic, and cultural security of hundreds of millions of people all over the world. However, 30% of all reefs are severely damaged, and it is projected that by the year 2030, more than 60% of these reefs will be lost. So as we highlight the importance of coral reefs in the marine ecosystem, we will also dive into the impacts affecting the coral reefs. It will be vital to note the drivers and the pressures affecting the coral reefs and the individual effect on the physical state of these reefs. And to that end, we will also have to look into the measures that we can take to help support the structure of the coral reefs so that they are here to stay for more years to come. This actually aligns with the Sustainable Development Goals relating to the Sustainable Blue Economy, otherwise known as SDG 14. This goal actually seeks to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources, ensuring sustainable development. So what are our learning outcomes? One, it is to understand or define what are coral reefs and their composition. Two, we'll also look into the importance of coral reefs in the marine life. And last but not least, we'll use the DPSIR model so that we can be able to understand the factors, impacts, and measures that we can take so as to ensure we are able to mitigate and remedy the degradation of the Great Barrier Reef. So, what are coral reefs? A coral in itself is an underwater garden that is surrounded by multicolored fish. The coral ecosystems are built by coral polyps. These polyps usually secrete calcium carbonate that hardens and forms a hard coral reef structure. These exoskeletons usually protect the soft corals. And so, as one hard exoskeleton is formed on top of the other, the coral reefs actually grow. And then they dive deep into the sea surface so that you are able to see huge coral reefs form over time. In a paper, What Are Coral Reefs?, done in the year 2018, Rachel Ross notes that the soft corals whose exoskeletons are not strong form up the flexible organisms that resemble plants and species such as sea ferns and sea whips. So let us have a look at the DPSIR framework. DPSIR actually stands for drivers, pressures, states, impacts, and the response. The DPSIR framework is a model that is often used so as to assess and manage environmental problems. The model in itself helps in simplifying and breaking down issues or complex undertakings systematically, having the capability of highlighting challenges that would easily have bypassed us. So, what are drivers? Drivers are socio-economic and socio-cultural forces that either increase or mitigate pressures on the environment or ecosystems. Drivers are actually divided into two. That is direct drivers and indirect drivers. Direct drivers include industrialization, urbanization, and climate change. Industrialization, as you all know, is the development of industries in a region. Industrial processes like manufacturing, mining, and chemical processing lead to land degradation, water pollution, and loss of marine ecosystem. According to the United Nations Environmental Programme, that is UNEP, industrial activities are primary drivers in biodiversity loss, with species extinction rates accelerating to 1,000 times the natural background rate. Is urbanization. Urbanization is the transformation of an occupied or sparsely occupied land into densely occupied cities. Areas can grow due to increase in the human population or the migration of people into urban areas. So urbanization often results to deforestation, habitat loss, and extraction of fresh water from the ecosystem. That is the climate change. So greenhouse gases emissions from industrial activities contribute to global warming. This alters ecosystems and affects the species migrating patterns. Third is climate change. Greenhouse gas emissions from industrial activities actually contribute to global warming. This alters ecosystems and affects species migration patterns and their breeding cycles. The primary greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, methane, and the nitrous oxide. The rise in greenhouse gas emissions has led to climate change. Let us have a look at the indirect factors. The first indirect factor that we look into is migration. As we all know, migration is the movement of people across towns to developed areas. The second indirect pattern is population growth. Population growth is as a result of migration. Or you get instances that the human population itself in that region has grown over time. And this will also affect the ecosystem or the marine ecosystem itself in that region. Third is the increase in personal wealth and living standards. The next item in the DPSIR framework is pressures. Pressures are usually generated by the drivers, and these usually stress either the natural or the human systems. Pressures on natural systems include issues to do with acidification of the seawater, the warming of the seawater, the increase in level of the sea, or otherwise known as increase in sea level, and the fourth but not least is the change in habitat. The pressures that relate to human systems include pollution, ship emissions to the air and the water. Pressures that relate to the human systems include pollution, ship emissions to air and water. Third, the need for energy generation, that is both renewable and non-renewable energy. Fourth is the land and sea use change resulting from shipping and port development and operations. Fourth item in the framework is the state. The state, we can define it as the change in condition of the environment. The fourth item in the framework is impacts. In short, what are the effects of any of the change in state? The effects can be economic, they can be environmental, or they can be social. Last but not least is the response. That is, how does the society itself decide to respond to these impacts? Diefenberg and Burns article produced in the year 2023 further highlights that global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to the period 1850 to 1900 is likely to be reached by the year 2035. The second threat is actually declining water quality. This is usually as a result of land-based runoff. The main pollutants posing a threat to the reef are fine sediments, excessive nutrients and pesticides used in the agricultural activities. It is important to note that there are 35 major catchments modified for agricultural activities, all draining to the Great Barrier Reef region. The third threat is coastal development. The fourth threat that the Great Barrier Reef goes through is the destructive fishing practices found within that region. The fifth threat is the effect of the crown of thorns starfish. According to an article by Dr. Glenn, produced in the year 2012, it actually illuminates that 42% of the loss in coral cover at the Great Barrier Reef is caused by the crown of thorns starfish. These starfish are native coral predators of the reef. So having looked you get the threats that the Great Barrier Reef are exposed to. Then it is easier to now dive into the use of the DPSLR framework. We will group all the threats under pressure because these are the things that actually change the natural ecosystem of the reef. After that, we will look at the drivers. So let's take the first instance, and that is sea temperature change. What affects the sea temperature change? And that is the climate change. So that will be our driver. Then we'll look at state change. What happens when there's a change in sea temperature? You get instances of bleaching of the coral. Then, what will be the impact? When these coral reefs are bleaching, what are the impacts? You'd get instances of reduced resilience, and also it leads to a reduction in tourism. After filling up the driver, the pressure, the state change, and the impact, it is easier to come up with a response. Having looked at all these four factors, coming up with the response is quite easy because now we look at the response either in terms of what can we do to the change in state, or we look at how do we respond to the pressure or the driver itself. In this instance, it's easier to look at. So having come up with the driver, the pressure, the state change, and the impact, it's now easy to come up with the response in specific. How would we respond to what? The impact, let's say, for example. Matters to do with tourism, maybe would find ways in which we will attract more tourists towards the region using other channels or other natural features that will attract tourists. Another thing we can look at is, let's say, matters to do with maybe the driver. When we're looking at the driver, the issue there is climate change. How do we look at, how do we respond to climate change? One of the key areas is policy-wise. You'd get, make up a framework or policies that actually limit the pollution of the air so that there's a release of less poisonous gases into the air. Also, we can respond into matters to do with the sea temperature change, but that actually ultimately just takes us back to the driver. The second threat that we looked at is the declining water quality. Now, in that, the driver would be the industrialization. The state change, again, ask yourself, there is declining water quality, so what? The coral reef in itself gets damaged. That's the change in state. Lastly is now the impact. When the coral reef is damaged, what happens? There is less resilience, and secondly, there is also a reduction in tourism. So responding to this, again, we'll have to look at it wholesomely. We can look into matters to do with the industrialization, again, back to policy-wise, which actually would take much time if there is no government support. But if we have policies in place that actually limit the quantity of, then how would we respond to this? For the declining water quality, we have so many ways, and the first way is maybe we look at the pressure. We say that the declining water quality is because of land-based runoffs. So if we can look into how we are able to limit release of or land-based runoff into the sea, it will help us in curbing this pressure. Again, look into the driver itself, which is industrialization. So how do we tackle industrialization? Again, government, with its goodwill, come up with policies that actually guide the industries in what they release into the sea through the water catchment areas. The third pressure that we looked at is the coastal development. And here we have migration of people, or just migration of people into coastal region in itself. The driver here would be urbanization. And then once there is coastal development, what happens? There is smoothed coral. What will be the impact? Again, there is reduced resilience of the coral reef itself, and also a reduction in tourism. The response to this would actually be clear-cut if you think about it, is that we would look at the pressure itself, and that is we could limit the number of people moving into the coastline region. Just finishing up, I'm glad that you have joined me in this session. I hope it has been one that has been enlightening and given you the necessary skills and knowledge in matters to do with coral reefs